In a world where women are told they can't handle heavy weapons, where military protocols seem designed to keep them in supporting roles, one moment of defiance can shatter every assumption. When Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez felt her commanding officer's hands wrench away her AR-15 during a crucial training exercise, something inside her snapped. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for years to come, challenge decades of gender bias, and prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the rifle in your hands, it's the determination in your heart. This isn't just another story about breaking barriers. This is about the split second when everything changes, when years of suppressed frustration explode into 10 perfect shots that echo far beyond any shooting range. This is about a woman who refused to let anyone define her limits, and how one act of rebellion became a legend that would inspire countless others to pick up arms and fight for their place in a world that never wanted them there. Get ready for a story that will make you question everything you think you know about strength, courage, and what it really means to fight for your dreams when the entire system is designed to watch you fail. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Liberty's training grounds as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her grip on the AR-15. Her calloused fingers found their familiar positions along the rifle's frame, muscle memory guiding every movement. 26 years old and 7 years into her military career, Maria had earned her place among the elite marksmen of the 82nd Airborne Division through sheer determination and countless hours of practice that left her shoulders aching and her trigger finger steady as granite. Colonel James Morrison watched from 30 yards away, his weathered face set in the permanent scowl that had become his trademark over 3 decades of military service. At 54, Morrison represented everything Maria had learned to navigate carefully in her career. Old-school military thinking, wrapped in the authority of rank, and reinforced by an unshakable belief that some things should never change. His steel-gray eyes tracked her movements with the intensity of a predator studying prey, waiting for the moment when she would prove his point about women in combat roles. The training exercise had been designed to test advanced marksmanship skills under pressure. Targets positioned at varying distances from 100 to 600 yards, some stationary, others moving on mechanical tracks that simulated battlefield conditions. Wind gauges scattered across the range provided real-time data on conditions that could mean the difference between a clean hit and a dangerous miss in actual combat. Maria had completed similar exercises dozens of times, consistently posting scores that ranked her in the top 5% of all shooters in her unit. But today felt different. Morrison had been making comments all morning, each one carefully crafted to sound like professional observation while carrying the unmistakable sting of condescension. During the equipment check, he had questioned whether she could handle the rifle's recoil over extended firing. When she demonstrated her knowledge of ballistics calculations, he suggested that theoretical knowledge didn't always translate to practical application. Each comment was delivered with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes, the expression of someone who believed he was being generous by allowing her to participate at all. Maria's squad leader, Sergeant First Class David Chen, stood nearby with obvious discomfort etched across his features. Chen had worked with Maria for 3 years and had seen her outshoot seasoned veterans who had twice her experience. His loyalty was divided between supporting his soldier and maintaining the chain of command that kept military units functioning. The tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes darted between Maria and Morrison told a story of a man caught between what he knew was right and what his position required him to accept. The other soldiers on the range that morning included Corporal Jason Webb, a 22-year-old sharpshooter from Tennessee whose daddy had taught him to shoot before he could properly tie his shoes. Webb had initially resented Maria's presence among the elite shooters, believing her position was the result of political correctness rather than skill. However, after watching her consistently outperform half the men in their unit, his attitude had shifted to grudging respect. Private First Class Tommy Martinez, barely 19 and still struggling to find his place in military culture, watched the interaction between Maria and Morrison with wide eyes that reflected both confusion and growing awareness of dynamics he had never considered before. The morning had progressed through standard drills without incident. Maria's shots had been precise and controlled, her breathing steady, her stance textbook perfect. She had scored 94% accuracy on moving targets, 97% on stationary ones. Her reload times were consistently under 3 seconds, and her weapon handling demonstrated the kind of fluid competence that came from thousands of hours of practice. By every measurable standard, she was performing at an elite level. Morrison's criticism had been persistent but subtle. He questioned her sight adjustments even when her shots were hitting center mass. He suggested modifications to her stance that would have reduced her stability. When she achieved a particularly impressive grouping at 500 yards, he attributed it to favorable wind conditions rather than skill. Each comment chipped away at the professional atmosphere that should have characterized a training exercise, replacing it with something that felt more like a test of endurance than marksmanship. The breaking point came during the final phase of training. Maria had been assigned to demonstrate rapid target engagement, a skill that required transitioning quickly between multiple targets while maintaining accuracy. It was a technique she had mastered through countless practice sessions, one that had earned her recognition in competitive shooting circles before her military career. The targets were arranged in a complex pattern that required engaging 10 different positions in sequence, with each shot needing to be delivered within precise time parameters to simulate the split-second decisions of combat situations. Maria settled into her firing position with the confidence of someone who had performed this routine hundreds of times before. Her breathing slowed to the steady rhythm that preceded her best shooting. Her heart rate dropped into the zone where her body became a stable platform for precision work. The rifle felt like an extension of her body, its weight distributed perfectly across her frame. She began her mental countdown, visualizing the sequence of movements that would take her from target to target in fluid succession. Morrison chose that moment to approach. His boots crunched on the gravel behind her position, and she could sense his presence without turning around. Professional protocol required her to maintain her focus on the exercise, but some instinct warned her that something was wrong. The colonel's shadow fell across her position as he moved closer, his breathing audible in the relative quiet of the range. When Morrison's hand closed around the barrel of her rifle, Maria's world crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. The casual way he grasped the weapon, as if it were a toy that needed to be taken from a child who couldn't handle it properly, triggered something deep in her psyche that went beyond professional indignation. This wasn't just about military protocol or chain of command. This was about every time she had been told she wasn't strong enough, wasn't tough enough, wasn't built for this kind of work. This was about proving herself again and again only to have her accomplishments dismissed or attributed to luck, favorable conditions, or lowered standards. The colonel's grip tightened as he attempted to lift the rifle from her hands. His voice carried the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. He spoke about proper technique, about the importance of following established procedures, about the need for soldiers to know their limitations. But Maria heard something else in his words, the assumption that her limitations were predetermined by her gender, that her best efforts would never be sufficient to meet the standards expected of her male counterparts. For 7 years, Maria had navigated the complex politics of military service as a woman in combat roles. She had learned to pick her battles carefully, to prove her worth through performance rather than confrontation. She had endured comments about her appearance when she should have been evaluated on her abilities. She had watched less qualified men receive opportunities that were denied to her. She had smiled politely at jokes that weren't funny and accepted praise that felt patronizing, because maintaining harmony in her unit was more important than her personal feelings. But something about this moment was different. Perhaps it was the public nature of Morrison's action, performed in front of her peers in a way that seemed designed to humiliate rather than instruct. Perhaps it was the accumulation of years of subtle disrespect finally reaching a tipping point. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that no amount of accommodation and professionalism would ever be enough to earn the basic respect that should have come with her rank and demonstrated competence. Maria's hands remained steady on the rifle even as Morrison attempted to remove it from her grip. Her voice, when she spoke, carried 7 years of suppressed frustration wrapped in the controlled tone of someone who had learned to channel anger into precise action. She looked directly into the colonel's eyes and spoke words that would be remembered long after the echo of gunshots had faded from the range. The next few seconds would define everything that came after. The other soldiers stopped their conversations and turned to watch. Sergeant Chen stepped forward, unsure whether to intervene or allow the situation to play out. The morning air seemed to hold its breath as two very different philosophies about military service, gender roles, and earned respect faced each other across a distance measured in inches, but representing decades of cultural evolution. Maria felt the rifle's familiar weight in her hands and made a decision that would change everything. She had spent her entire career proving that she belonged in a world that never quite believed she deserved to be there. Today, she would prove it one more time, but on her own terms, and in a way that would leave no room for doubt or dismissal. The targets downrange waited in silent testimony to what was about to unfold, each one representing not just a test of marksmanship, but a statement about who had the right to hold the weapon and what they could do when given the chance to show their true capabilities. The morning sun continued to cast its long shadows across the training ground, but everything else was about to change in ways that none of them could have anticipated. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, Maria Rodriguez prepared to rewrite the rules of engagement in her ongoing war for recognition, respect, and the right to serve her country on equal terms with anyone who had ever questioned whether she belonged there. The tension on the firing range had become thick enough to cut with a bayonet. Maria's grip on her AR-15 remained firm despite Colonel Morrison's attempt to remove it from her hands. Her knuckles had gone white with the pressure, but her arms stayed steady as rocks. Every soldier within 50 yards had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold, sensing that they were witnessing something that would become part of base legend regardless of how it ended. Morrison's face had flushed red with the kind of anger that came from having his authority challenged in front of subordinates. His military bearing, cultivated over 3 decades of service, demanded immediate compliance with his commands. The idea that a staff sergeant would resist his direct action was so foreign to his worldview that for a moment he seemed genuinely confused by Maria's defiance. His grip on the rifle barrel tightened as he attempted to use his superior size and strength to simply take what he considered rightfully his to control. But Maria had not spent 7 years building the muscle memory of weapons handling to give up her rifle without a fight. Her body had been conditioned through thousands of hours of training to maintain perfect control under pressure. The same steady hands that could place shots within a 2-inch grouping at 300 yards were not about to tremble now, even with a colonel trying to wrench her weapon away. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the crystalline clarity of someone who had reached the point where consequences no longer mattered as much as principles. "Sir, with all due respect, I am qualified and ready to complete this exercise." The words came out measured and professional, but everyone present could hear the steel underneath. Maria's eyes never wavered from Morrison's face as she spoke. "I have consistently demonstrated proficiency with this weapon system and have earned the right to prove my capabilities without interference." Morrison's response revealed the depth of his conviction that the military hierarchy he had served faithfully for 30 years was being undermined by social experiments and political correctness. His voice carried the authority of 3 decades of command, but also a frustration with changes he neither understood nor accepted. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you will release this weapon immediately and report to my office for counseling on proper respect for chain of command. Your attitude demonstrates exactly why certain positions require maturity and emotional stability that may be lacking in soldiers who haven't proven they can handle the pressure of combat situations." The words hit Maria like physical blows, each phrase carefully chosen to undermine not just her immediate actions, but her entire military career. The reference to emotional stability was particularly cutting, playing into stereotypes about women in military service that she had spent years disproving through consistent professional performance. The suggestion that she hadn't proven herself capable of handling combat pressure ignored her deployment record, her marksmanship achievements, and every metric by which military competence was traditionally measured. Sergeant Chen found himself in an impossible position. Military protocol was clear about respecting the chain of command, but he had worked closely enough with Maria to know that her competence was unquestionable. His own career advancement depended on maintaining good relationships with senior officers, but his integrity as a non-commissioned officer required him to protect his soldiers from unfair treatment. The conflict between these competing loyalties was visible in the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, as he tried to find a way to defuse the situation without compromising anyone's career. The other soldiers on the range represented a cross-section of military culture at a moment of transition. Corporal Webb had grown up in a family where traditional gender roles were never questioned, but his experience working with Maria had challenged those assumptions in ways he was still processing. Private Martinez was young enough to have grown up in a more egalitarian environment, but old enough to recognize the power dynamics at play and the potential consequences for everyone involved. Their faces reflected the broader struggle within military culture to balance respect for tradition with recognition of changing capabilities and expectations. Maria's decision to hold her ground wasn't born from momentary anger or impulse. It represented the culmination of years of careful calculation about when accommodation became capitulation, when diplomacy became self-betrayal. She had watched other women in her position choose the path of least resistance, accepting limitations and indignities in order to maintain their positions. She had seen promising careers derailed by confrontations with superiors who viewed their presence as unwelcome intrusions into masculine spaces. But she had also seen what happened to women who never stood up for themselves. They became cautionary tales, examples of why integration efforts were doomed to fail. The rifle between them had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of everything both of them believed about military service, gender roles, and earned authority. For Morrison, removing the weapon from Maria's hands was about maintaining the natural order that had served the military effectively for generations. In his worldview, accommodation of women in combat roles represented a weakening of standards that would ultimately compromise military effectiveness. His actions were motivated not by personal animosity, but by genuine conviction that he was protecting institutional integrity. For Maria, maintaining her grip on the rifle represented the right to be judged by the same standards as her male counterparts. Every qualification she had earned, every score she had posted, every commendation she had received had been in pursuit of the simple recognition that her gender should not determine her opportunities or limitations. The weapon in her hands was proof of her competence, and surrendering it without demonstration would validate every assumption about women's unsuitability for combat roles. The standoff continued for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Other training activities on the range had come to a complete halt as soldiers, instructors, and support personnel turned their attention to the drama unfolding at firing position 7. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of engines from the motor pool and the occasional crack of gunfire from ranges farther away, where normal training continued unaware of the confrontation that was reshaping careers and relationships. Morrison's next move revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the woman he was dealing with. Believing that increased pressure would force compliance, he shifted his grip on the rifle and used his size advantage to try to physically overpower Maria's resistance. The action was calculated to demonstrate his authority while avoiding the kind of dramatic confrontation that might attract unwanted attention from higher command. In his experience, soldiers who were reminded of the physical realities of military hierarchy quickly remembered their proper place in the chain of command. But Maria's response showed that she had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Her body positioning shifted almost imperceptibly, using leverage and technique rather than brute strength to maintain control of her weapon. Her training in combatives, which Morrison had probably dismissed as politically correct window dressing, suddenly became relevant in ways he hadn't anticipated. The rifle remained firmly in her hands despite his efforts, and her voice, when she spoke again, carried a new edge that made it clear she was prepared to escalate the situation rather than back down. "Colonel Morrison, I am requesting permission to complete the marksmanship exercise I was assigned. I am fully qualified, properly equipped, and ready to demonstrate the capabilities I have spent 7 years developing. If you have concerns about my performance, I respectfully suggest you allow me to complete the exercise and evaluate the results rather than making assumptions about my abilities." The formal language of her request couldn't disguise what everyone present understood to be happening. Maria was forcing Morrison to make a choice between allowing her to prove her capabilities or taking disciplinary action against a soldier who had done nothing more than request the opportunity to complete her assigned training. The public nature of the confrontation meant that whatever happened next would be witnessed and remembered by every soldier present, creating ripple effects that would extend far beyond the immediate participants. Morrison's face had moved beyond red into purple territory as he struggled with the realization that his authority was being challenged, not through insubordination or disrespect, but through the kind of calm professionalism that was harder to punish without appearing arbitrary or vindictive. His military training had prepared him for dealing with obvious violations of discipline, but Maria's approach left him in the uncomfortable position of having to either grant her request or explain why a qualified soldier was being prevented from completing routine training. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, each second increasing the pressure on both participants. Maria's hands remained steady on her rifle, her breathing controlled, her posture erect. Morrison's grip on the barrel hadn't loosened, but his confidence in his position had begun to waver as he recognized that forcing the issue might create more problems than allowing it to proceed. The other soldiers watched in fascination, as two strong-willed individuals fought a battle that was about much more than a single training exercise. What happened next would be determined by who was willing to risk more for their principles. Maria had already crossed lines that might affect her career regardless of the outcome. Morrison faced the choice between maintaining his position through force or finding a way to retreat without losing face. The rifle between them had become the fulcrum on which both of their futures balanced, and neither was prepared to let go without a fight that would test everything they believed about military service, earned respect, and the changing nature of American armed forces. The sun continued its arc across the morning sky, but time seemed suspended in the space between command and defiance, between tradition and change, between two very different visions of what it meant to serve with honor in an organization struggling to balance its proud heritage with the demands of an evolving world. The standoff between Maria Rodriguez and Colonel Morrison had reached a critical mass that demanded resolution. The other soldiers on the firing range stood frozen in place, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing a moment that would be talked about for years to come. The morning air seemed charged with electricity as two fundamentally different philosophies about military service and human potential faced each other across the length of an AR-15 rifle that had become the physical representation of their conflict. Morrison's grip on the barrel had begun to show the strain of the prolonged confrontation. His knuckles were white with effort, and small beads of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the cool morning temperature. The colonel's breathing had become slightly labored, not from physical exertion, but from the stress of having his authority challenged in such a public and definitive way. His eyes darted briefly to the assembled soldiers, calculating the damage to his command presence that would result from whatever happened next. Maria's resolve had only strengthened during the confrontation. 7 years of military service had taught her to recognize the moment when accommodation became surrender, when professional courtesy became self-betrayal. Her grip on the rifle hadn't wavered despite Morrison's attempts to remove it from her hands. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried the quiet authority of someone who had found her line in the sand and was prepared to defend it regardless of consequences. "Sir, I have a proposal." The words cut through the tension like a blade, formal and respectful, but carrying an undertone that suggested negotiation rather than submission. "Allow me to complete the marksmanship exercise exactly as it was designed. 10 targets, rapid engagement, standard scoring criteria. If I fail to meet the established standards, I will accept whatever disciplinary action you deem appropriate and will request transfer to a different unit. If I meet or exceed the standards, then we can have a conversation about whether my gender affects my ability to serve effectively in my current role." The proposal caught Morrison off guard. He had expected either complete submission or escalating defiance, but Maria's suggestion offered him a way to resolve the situation without losing face while still maintaining his position that women weren't suited for certain military roles. His calculation was simple. If she failed the exercise under pressure, it would validate his beliefs and provide justification for his actions. If she succeeded, he could claim that allowing her to prove herself demonstrated his fairness and commitment to objective evaluation of soldier capabilities. Sergeant Chen stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to defuse the situation while protecting his soldier. His voice carried the diplomatic tone of a professional non-commissioned officer navigating between competing interests. "Sir, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has consistently scored in the 95th percentile on marksmanship evaluations. The exercise parameters are standardized across all units, and her performance will be objectively measurable. It might provide valuable data about individual soldier capabilities under stress. The suggestion of objective measurement appealed to Morrison's sense of military order. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on making decisions based on performance data rather than personal preferences. The challenge was that Maria's performance data had consistently contradicted his assumptions about gender-based limitations. Allowing her to complete the exercise would either validate his concerns about women under pressure or force him to reconsider positions he had held for decades. Corporal Webb found his voice for the first time since the confrontation began. His southern drawl carried genuine curiosity rather than skepticism as he addressed Morrison. "Colonel, sir, I've worked with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez for 2 years now. I've seen her outshoot men who have been hunting since they were children. If she says she can do it, I believe we should give her the chance to prove it." The endorsement from Webb carried particular weight because his initial skepticism about women in combat roles was well known throughout the unit. Private Martinez nodded in agreement, his youth making him less concerned about challenging authority than his older counterparts. "She's never missed a qualification, sir. Her reload times are faster than mine, and her shot groupings are tighter than anyone else in our squad. I think she's earned the right to show what she can do." The chorus of support from her fellow soldiers seemed to surprise Morrison more than anything else that had happened during the confrontation. His assumption that other male soldiers would naturally support his position was being contradicted by the very men he thought he was protecting. Their respect for Maria's abilities, earned through consistent performance rather than granted through policy, represented a generational shift in military culture that he was struggling to understand. Maria sensed the shift in momentum and pressed her advantage with the kind of tactical awareness that had made her an effective soldier. Her voice remained respectful but carried new confidence as she addressed Morrison directly. "Colonel, I understand your concerns about maintaining standards and ensuring unit effectiveness. I share those concerns, but I believe the best way to address them is through demonstration rather than assumption. Give me the opportunity to show you what 7 years of training and commitment have produced." The moment of decision had arrived. Morrison could feel the eyes of every soldier on the range watching to see how he would handle a situation that had moved far beyond simple military discipline. His choices were limited to granting Maria's request or taking disciplinary action that would look arbitrary and potentially discriminatory to outside observers. The political implications of either choice weighed heavily on a career that had been built on avoiding controversy while maintaining operational effectiveness. Morrison's decision came suddenly, delivered with the kind of authoritative tone that had characterized his entire military career. "Very well, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. You will have your opportunity to prove your capabilities, but understand that this is not just about marksmanship scores. This is about performance under pressure, about decision-making when careers and reputations are on the line, about proving that integration policies don't compromise military effectiveness." The colonel's hand slowly released its grip on the rifle barrel, but his eyes never left Maria's face as he stepped back to provide her with a clear field of fire. The symbolism of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. The passing of the weapon from male authority to female determination represented something larger than a single training exercise. It was a test of principles, a validation of years of argument and counter-argument about gender roles in military service. Maria felt the full weight of the rifle return to her control and experienced a moment of crystalline clarity about what she was about to attempt. The 10 targets arranged downrange weren't just pieces of paper marked with scoring rings. They were representations of every doubt that had ever been expressed about her capabilities, every assumption that had been made about her limitations, every barrier that had been placed in her path during 7 years of military service. The other soldiers had formed a loose semicircle behind the firing line, their attention focused entirely on Maria's preparation. The usual sounds of military training, engine noise, shouted commands, equipment being moved, seemed muted as if the entire base was holding its breath waiting to see what would happen next. Even the wind had died down, creating ideal conditions for precision shooting that would eliminate external factors as excuses for either success or failure. Maria's breathing slowed to the controlled rhythm she had practiced thousands of times before. Her heart rate dropped into the zone where her body became a stable platform for precise shooting. The rifle settled into her shoulder pocket with the familiarity of a well-worn piece of clothing, its weight distributed perfectly across her frame. Her cheek found its natural position on the stock, and her eye aligned with the sight picture that had become second nature through years of repetitive training. But this wasn't just another training exercise. The stakes were higher than any competition she had ever entered, any qualification she had ever attempted. This was about proving that gender didn't determine capability, that assumptions weren't substitutes for evaluation, that earned respect should be based on performance rather than preconceived notions about who belonged in certain roles. The target seemed to stand out with unusual clarity as Maria began her mental preparation for the rapid engagement sequence. Each one represented a specific challenge: distance, angle, size, movement pattern that would test different aspects of her shooting skills. The exercise was designed to simulate combat conditions where split-second decisions and precise execution could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Morrison stood 30 yards to her left, his arms crossed and his expression skeptical but attentive. He had agreed to let her attempt the exercise, but his body language made it clear that he expected her to fail under the pressure he had created. His concept of military effectiveness was built on physical and emotional standards that he believed favored male soldiers, and he was prepared to use any substandard performance as validation of those beliefs. Maria's finger found the trigger guard as she completed her final preparations. 7 years of military service, thousands of hours of training, and a lifetime of proving herself had led to this moment. The next 30 seconds would either validate everything she had worked for or provide ammunition for those who believed she didn't belong in uniform. The choice between success and failure was entirely in her hands, exactly where she had always wanted it to be. The morning sun continued its journey across the sky, but time seemed suspended in the moment before action. Maria Rodriguez stood at the threshold between doubt and certainty, between assumption and proof, between the way things had always been and the way they could become. The rifle in her hands held more than ammunition. It held the power to change minds, challenge conventions, and prove that courage and competence knew no gender boundaries. What happened next would be determined entirely by her ability to translate years of preparation into seconds of perfect execution under the most intense pressure of her military career. The moment Maria Rodriguez settled into her final firing position, everything else on Fort Liberty's training grounds seemed to fade into background noise. The assembled soldiers, the skeptical colonel, the weight of expectations and prejudices, all of it dissolved into irrelevance as her mind entered the focused state that had taken 7 years to perfect. Her breathing slowed to the steady rhythm of someone whose body had been conditioned to perform under pressure, each exhale releasing tension, while maintaining the rock-steady platform necessary for precision shooting. The first target stood 100 yards downrange, a standard silhouette that would have been routine under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Maria understood that every shot would be scrutinized not just for accuracy, but for what it represented about women's capabilities in military service. Her sight picture aligned perfectly as muscle memory took control of movements that had been practiced thousands of times before. The trigger broke cleanly under steady pressure from her index finger, and the first shot rang out across the range with the sharp crack that announced the beginning of something extraordinary. The bullet struck dead center in the target's scoring rings, a perfect hit that would have been impressive under any conditions, but seemed almost miraculous given the pressure of the situation. Maria didn't pause to admire her work or acknowledge the murmur of appreciation from the watching soldiers. Her body was already transitioning to the second target, located 150 yards away at a slight angle that required adjustment for both distance and wind drift. Colonel Morrison's expression hadn't changed after the first shot, but his posture had shifted slightly as he recognized that Maria's performance might not follow the script he had expected. His arms remained crossed, and his face maintained the skeptical expression that had characterized his attitude throughout the confrontation. But there was something in his eyes that suggested he was beginning to understand that he might have underestimated the woman whose capabilities he had so confidently dismissed. The second shot followed within 3 seconds of the first, demonstrating the kind of rapid target transition that separated elite marksmen from merely competent shooters. Maria's rifle swung smoothly to the new target, her body positioning adjusting automatically to accommodate the different angle and distance. The sight picture settled, her breathing paused at the natural respiratory pause, and the trigger broke with the same clean precision as before. Another perfect center hit that brought a whistle of appreciation from Corporal Webb, who had developed genuine respect for Maria's shooting abilities over their 2 years of working together. By the third target, positioned 200 yards away and partially obscured by intervening terrain, the other soldiers on the range had begun to realize they were witnessing something special. This wasn't just competent marksmanship. This was a demonstration of skills that belonged in the top tier of military shooters. Maria's transitions between targets were fluid and controlled, her rifle moving with the kind of precision that came from perfect integration between mind and muscle. Each shot was delivered with mechanical consistency that eliminated human error as a factor in the equation. The fourth target presented the first real challenge of the sequence, a moving silhouette that traveled laterally across a 200-yard range on a motorized track system. Engaging moving targets required not just accuracy, but the ability to calculate lead times and predict target movement while maintaining shooting fundamentals under time pressure. Maria's training had included hundreds of hours of practice on similar systems, but the psychological pressure of the current situation added variables that no training exercise could perfectly replicate. Maria's rifle tracked the moving target smoothly, her body pivoting from the waist while her upper torso remained stable. The sight picture showed the proper lead angle for a target moving at the programmed speed, and her trigger control remained consistent with the previous shots. The bullet intercepted the target perfectly, striking center mass in a way that demonstrated not just accuracy, but sophisticated understanding of ballistics and target prediction. The hit brought an audible gasp from Private Martinez, who had never seen anyone make such a shot look routine. Morrison's skeptical expression was beginning to crack around the edges as he watched Maria's performance exceed every expectation he had formed about women's capabilities under pressure. His military experience had taught him to recognize exceptional shooting when he saw it, and what he was witnessing challenged fundamental assumptions he had held for 30 years. The cognitive dissonance between his beliefs and the evidence being presented in real time was visible in the way his posture had begun to straighten, and his arms had uncrossed despite his apparent effort to maintain his skeptical demeanor. The 5th through 7th targets were positioned at varying distances between 250 and 400 yards, each one requiring different considerations for bullet drop, wind drift, and environmental conditions that could affect trajectory. Maria's shot sequence continued with the same methodical precision that had characterized her performance from the beginning. Her rifle moved from target to target with mechanical consistency, each engagement following the same pattern of smooth transition, sight alignment, breathing control, and trigger manipulation that had become automatic through years of practice. Each successive hit was met with growing amazement from the assembled soldiers, who had begun to understand that they were witnessing not just exceptional shooting, but a redefinition of what they thought they knew about military capabilities and gender limitations. Webb had stopped trying to maintain his professional composure and was openly starring at Maria's performance with the kind of respect usually reserved for legendary figures in military folklore. Martinez was taking mental notes on her technique, recognizing that he was receiving a masterclass in advanced marksmanship from someone who clearly belonged among the military's elite shooters. Sergeant Chen's face showed a mixture of pride and vindication as he watched his soldier demonstrate the capabilities he had tried to explain to Morrison during previous discussions about unit assignments and advancement opportunities. His loyalty to Maria had been tested by the morning's confrontation, but her performance was validating every positive evaluation he had ever written about her abilities and potential. The objective nature of marksmanship scores was eliminating any possibility that his support could be attributed to favoritism or political correctness, rather than genuine assessment of military competence. The 8th target presented the greatest technical challenge of the sequence, positioned at 500 yards with intervening terrain that created complex wind patterns and elevation changes that affected bullet trajectory. Engaging targets at such distances required not just shooting skills, but sophisticated understanding of external ballistics and environmental conditions that many soldiers never fully mastered. Maria's preparation for this shot was slightly more deliberate than her previous engagements, taking an extra moment to read wind indicators and adjust her sight picture for the challenging conditions. The shot rang out across the range with the same authority as its predecessors, and the spotting scope confirmed what everyone had begun to expect: another perfect center hit that demonstrated mastery of advanced marksmanship principles. The accuracy of the shot at such distance, under pressure, with witnesses evaluating every aspect of her performance, established Maria's credentials among the very best shooters in the military. Morrison's expression had moved beyond skepticism into something approaching grudging respect, though he clearly wasn't ready to abandon decades of convictions based on a single demonstration, however impressive. The ninth target returned to closer range, but introduced a different challenge, a smaller scoring area that required precision rather than power. Engaging small targets tested a shooter's ability to maintain fundamental shooting principles while dealing with reduced margin for error. Maria's rifle settled into the familiar firing position, her sight picture centering on the reduced target area with the same confidence she had shown throughout the sequence. The shot group was building into something that would be discussed in military shooting circles for years to come. As Maria prepared for the 10th and final target, the assembled soldiers had grown completely silent in recognition that they were witnessing the conclusion of something historic. The final target was positioned at 300 yards with additional scoring rings that required not just accuracy but precision placement within specific zones to achieve maximum points. It represented not just the end of the shooting sequence, but the culmination of Maria's argument that gender didn't determine capability, that assumptions weren't substitutes for evaluation, that respect should be earned through performance rather than granted through prejudice. Maria's breathing settled into the controlled pattern that had characterized her entire performance. The rifle felt like an extension of her body as she aligned the sight picture for the final engagement. Her finger took up the slack in the trigger with the same smooth pressure that had delivered 9 perfect shots before this one. The morning sun provided perfect lighting conditions, the wind had remained steady throughout the exercise, and her shooting platform was as stable as she could make it. The 10th shot broke with clean precision, the rifle recoiling smoothly against Maria's shoulder as the bullet traveled downrange toward its target. The sound of the shot seemed to hang in the air longer than the others, carrying with it the weight of everything that had led to this moment. 7 years of military service, countless hours of training, a confrontation with authority that had risked her entire career, and 30 seconds of shooting that had redefined what everyone present thought they knew about capability and gender. The spotting scope confirmed what had become inevitable over the course of the exercise, another perfect center hit that completed a shooting performance that would become legendary in military circles. 10 targets, 10 perfect shots, delivered under the most intense pressure imaginable in a demonstration that transcended simple marksmanship to become a statement about human potential, professional competence, and the danger of making assumptions about what people could accomplish when given the opportunity to prove themselves. Maria lowered her rifle and engaged the safety with movements that were steady and controlled, despite the adrenaline that was beginning to course through her system. She had done everything she said she would do, proved everything she had claimed she could prove, and demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond what even her supporters had expected. The silence that followed her final shot was filled with the kind of respect that could only be earned through performance that exceeded every possible expectation. The morning sun continued its journey across the sky, but everything else had changed in the 30 seconds it had taken Maria Rodriguez to rewrite the rules of engagement in her personal war for recognition, respect, and the right to serve her country on equal terms with anyone who had ever questioned whether she belonged in uniform. What happened next would determine whether her demonstration would translate into lasting change or remain an isolated moment of individual triumph in an ongoing struggle for equality in military service. The silence that followed Maria Rodriguez's 10th perfect shot stretched across Fort Liberty's training grounds like a held breath. For 30 seconds, she had rewritten the narrative about women's capabilities in military service, but the real test would come in how her demonstration was received, interpreted, and ultimately integrated into the larger conversation about gender roles in the armed forces. The assembled soldiers stood frozen in recognition that they had witnessed something that transcended routine training exercises to become a defining moment in their understanding of military competence and professional respect. Colonel Morrison's face had undergone a transformation that reflected the internal struggle between decades of conviction and the undeniable evidence of what he had just witnessed. His military training had taught him to evaluate soldiers based on objective performance metrics, but his personal beliefs about gender roles had created cognitive filters that made it difficult to process Maria's demonstration. The mathematical precision of 10 perfect shots under extreme pressure couldn't be explained away by luck, favorable conditions, or lowered standards. It was simply exceptional performance that demanded acknowledgement regardless of who had delivered it. Maria remained in position for several seconds after completing her demonstration, her rifle still pointed downrange as she processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. 7 years of military service had been building toward this moment, but now that it had arrived, she found herself uncertain about what came next. The shots had been perfect, her technique flawless, her composure maintained throughout the most stressful 30 seconds of her career. But changing minds and challenging institutional assumptions required more than individual demonstrations of competence, however impressive they might be. Sergeant Chen was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying professional pride mixed with personal vindication as he addressed the assembled group. That was a perfect score under combat stress conditions. 10 targets, 10 center hits, completion time well within established parameters. His words were delivered with the clinical precision of someone documenting performance for official records, but everyone present could hear the underlying satisfaction of a leader whose faith in his soldier had been completely validated. Corporal Webb stepped forward, his usual reserve replaced by obvious admiration for what he had just witnessed. His southern drawl carried genuine respect as he addressed Maria directly. "Staff Sergeant, I've been shooting since I was 6 years old, and I've never seen anything like that. My daddy always told me that good shooting was about heart as much as skill, and you just showed more heart than I've ever seen on any range." The endorsement from Webb was particularly meaningful because his initial skepticism about women in combat roles had been well known throughout the unit. Private Martinez nodded enthusiastically, his youth making him less constrained by traditional assumptions about military hierarchy and gender roles. "That was incredible, Staff Sergeant. I've never seen anyone shoot like that, especially under that kind of pressure. You made it look easy, but I know it wasn't." His words reflected the perspective of a generation that had grown up with more egalitarian expectations about gender capabilities, making him more able to appreciate Maria's demonstration without the psychological barriers that affected some of his older counterparts. Morrison's response came slowly, delivered with the careful consideration of someone whose worldview had been challenged in ways he was still struggling to process. His voice carried the authority of rank, but lacked the conviction that had characterized his earlier statements about women's limitations in military service. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, that was exceptional shooting. Your technical proficiency and performance under pressure were exemplary by any standard." The admission came reluctantly, but it represented a significant shift from his earlier position about her capabilities. But Maria recognized that individual acknowledgement, while personally satisfying, wouldn't be sufficient to create the broader changes needed to ensure equal opportunities for other women in military service. Her voice, when she responded to Morrison, carried the measured tone of someone who understood that her demonstration was just the beginning of a larger conversation. "Thank you, Colonel, but I want to be clear that this isn't about me proving I'm exceptional among women. This is about demonstrating that assumptions about gender-based limitations may not be supported by actual performance data." The distinction Maria made between individual exceptionalism and systemic evaluation was crucial to the broader implications of her demonstration. Military institutions had historically accommodated individual women who exceeded expectations while maintaining general policies that assumed female inferiority in combat-related capabilities. Maria's insistence on framing her performance as evidence about women's potential rather than personal achievement reflected her understanding that lasting change required challenging institutional assumptions rather than simply earning individual recognition. Morrison's struggle with this broader interpretation was visible in his response. His military experience had provided numerous examples of exceptional individuals who performed beyond normal expectations, but Maria's suggestion that her performance might be representative of broader capabilities challenged fundamental assumptions about military effectiveness and unit cohesion. "Staff Sergeant, exceptional individual performance doesn't necessarily translate to general capabilities across demographic groups. Military policies must be based on broader patterns rather than isolated examples of superior performance. The colonel's response revealed the depth of institutional resistance to change that extended beyond personal prejudices to encompass systemic concerns about military effectiveness. His argument that individual demonstrations couldn't support broader policy changes reflected genuine concerns about maintaining standards while also revealing the double standard that had historically been applied to women in military service. Male soldiers who demonstrated exceptional capabilities were often seen as validation of masculine suitability for combat roles, while exceptional female performance was dismissed as statistically irrelevant outliers. Maria's response to Morrison's argument demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of military culture and institutional dynamics that had enabled her to navigate 7 years of service in challenging environments. Her words were carefully chosen to acknowledge legitimate concerns about military effectiveness while challenging the assumptions that had been used to justify exclusionary policies. "Sir, I understand the concern about basing policies on individual performance. But I would suggest that assumptions about demographic limitations should also be subject to empirical testing rather than traditional beliefs." The conversation between Maria and Morrison had attracted the attention of other soldiers and instructors from across the training area, creating an impromptu forum for discussing issues that were usually avoided in professional military settings. The public nature of their exchange meant that whatever conclusions emerged from the discussion would be disseminated throughout the base and beyond, potentially influencing broader conversations about military policies and gender integration. Sergeant Chen recognized an opportunity to advance the discussion beyond individual personalities to focus on objective evaluation criteria that could inform future policy decisions. His intervention carried the diplomatic authority of a senior non-commissioned officer seeking to find common ground between competing perspectives. "Colonel, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has consistently scored in the top 5% of all shooters in our unit over the past 3 years. Her performance today was exceptional, but it's consistent with a pattern of superior capabilities that extends beyond this single demonstration." The documentation of Maria's consistent performance over time provided a more robust foundation for evaluating her capabilities than any single demonstration, however impressive. Chen's reference to objective performance metrics over extended periods offered a way to move the discussion beyond anecdotal evidence toward the kind of systematic evaluation that military institutions preferred for making policy decisions. Morrison's acknowledgement of Maria's documented performance record represented a significant concession from someone who had entered the morning convinced that her presence in elite units compromised military effectiveness. His words came slowly, reflecting the difficulty of reconciling new evidence with long-standing convictions. "The performance record is impressive. It suggests capabilities that exceed what I had understood to be typical for soldiers in your demographic category." The careful language of Morrison's response revealed both progress and continued resistance to fully acknowledging the implications of what he had witnessed. His reference to demographic category, rather than women or female soldiers, demonstrated lingering discomfort with directly addressing gender-based assumptions, while his admission that Maria's capabilities exceeded his expectations represented genuine intellectual honesty about the limitations of his previous understanding. Maria seized on Morrison's acknowledgement as an opportunity to advance the broader discussion about evaluation criteria and advancement opportunities that affected all women in military service. Her response was designed to build on his admission while pushing for practical changes in how capabilities were assessed and opportunities distributed. "Colonel, I would respectfully suggest that individual evaluation based on demonstrated performance might be more effective than demographic assumptions for making assignment and advancement decisions." The proposal Maria offered represented a fundamental shift from categorically excluding women from certain roles toward individual assessment that would allow qualified personnel to advance based on capabilities rather than gender. The suggestion challenged institutional practices that had historically limited opportunities based on assumptions about group characteristics rather than individual qualifications. As the morning progressed and word of the confrontation and demonstration spread throughout Fort Liberty, Maria's 30 seconds of perfect shooting began to take on larger significance as a symbol of changing expectations about military service and gender roles. Other female soldiers sought her out to discuss their own experiences with discrimination and limited opportunities, while male soldiers struggled to reconcile their observations of her capabilities with traditional assumptions about women's suitability for combat roles. The ripple effects of Maria's demonstration extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence discussions in barracks, mess halls, and training facilities across the base. Her insistence on being evaluated by the same standards as male counterparts resonated with other women who had experienced similar limitations, while her exceptional performance provided concrete evidence that could be cited in future discussions about military policies and advancement opportunities. Within weeks, Maria's story had spread throughout military networks and social media platforms, becoming a rallying point for advocates of gender equality in military service, while also attracting criticism from those who viewed her actions as disruptive to military order and discipline. The polarized responses reflected broader cultural divisions about gender roles and institutional change, but they also elevated conversations about military effectiveness and equal opportunity to national prominence. Colonel Morrison's eventual recommendation that Maria be considered for advanced sniper training represented a personal evolution that many observers found as remarkable as her shooting demonstration. His willingness to reconsider long-standing assumptions based on objective evidence of superior performance suggested that institutional change was possible when confronted with undeniable proof of individual capabilities. Maria Rodriguez's 30 seconds of perfect shooting had accomplished more than demonstrating exceptional marksmanship skills. It had forced a reckoning with assumptions about gender, capability, and earned respect that extended far beyond a single training exercise to influence military culture and national conversations about equality of opportunity in service to the country. Her legacy would be measured not just in perfect shots, but in the doors opened for future generations of women who would serve with the knowledge that competence and courage knew no gender boundaries.